Sat Shri Akal, Namaste, Adab to everyone who has turned up promptly. But as I've been saying in all these lives, we know that Asians tend to be fashionably late, so we'll give it a few more minutes to let the others arrive and also to wait for Jvala to come online as well. So give it a minute or two, but while you guys are waiting, just to remind you of this live conversation, it is about, we're discussing quite a few things, but namely this book, 54 Punjabi Proverbs. I know it's not reading correctly for you guys, but you get the gist. This is the book, and it was so it's a book of Punjabi wisdom passed down through the generations, written by Jvala Singh, and he released this last year, 2019, and Jvala and myself, we were invited on to the Sunny and Shay show to talk about this book, and we spoke about many things: Cockney rhyming slang, the origin of proverbs and idioms. So this discussion, we're going to touch on this book. We're also going to touch on Jwala's research that he's doing as a PhD student on poetic and literary devices, where he aims to translate some of the most important theological and historical Sikh texts. So a lot to do in an hour. I'll give it another minute or so. I'm just going to read actually while I wait. I can't see that Jwala's here. Oh, sorry, a few house rules. So I will disable the comments while we are having our conversation. Just allows us to have an unfiltered conversation without distraction. And then at the end, so I usually give about 15 to 20 minutes, I will enable the comments, and then if you have any questions or feedback, then by all means please do share them. And while the comments are disengaged or disabled, you can still put them in the comments box, and when I enable them they will appear. Or you can wait until the end after the discussion and see if there's anything particular based on what we've spoken about that you would like to offer feedback or commentary on. Can't see that Jwala's here. What's the exact time? 7:33. I usually give it till about 7:35, but for those of you that have arrived on time, thought I would just read. If you are not familiar with this book, it is sold out in the UK. However, I know Jvala has an announcement that he wants to make, so I'll let him share that. It did really well actually in the UK. I'm not sure about the other countries, but yeah, it's such a great book. We'll discuss it with Jvala in how it's quite a simple book. I'll just show you if you don't have it already. You know, it's quite simple. It's got the Punjabi proverb and then translation and transliteration. So, and there's 54 of them as well. And it's just such a simple book in that sense. But it had the ability to connect people, the diaspora namely, with their grandparents and their parents, and it was just lovely because this one proverb, just this one line or these few words, were able to just evoke memories of their parents or grandparents' childhood, which is really wonderful in an age and generation where we're disconnecting with our elders and they're becoming more and more invisible and marginalized. Such a simple book had the ability to connect. Okay, Jvala, if you're here, can you wave? Because it is 7:35 now. I'll wait for him. Live is showing reverse. Yes, I know it's showing the reverse, but like I said, it's just to gauge. This is the book with the Fulgari images. This is what you can look out for on Amazon. Let's invite Jvala. He might be here. I was going to read an intro. Let me see if he's here. Not here yet. Ah, he's here now. Okay, great. All right, Jvala. So I'm just going to do an introduction, which I've been doing for all of the guests. And it's tailored to each person. Once I've done the introduction, then I'll invite Jvala. So at this point, I'm going to disengage the comments, but please do save your questions for the end, where we'll have a chance to ask questions or provide commentary and feedback. So for those of you that don't know who Jvala Singh is, Jvala Singh is a lawyer, PhD student, and creator of mangalacharan.com, as well as author of 54 Punjabi proverbs, which we will be discussing. His research work embodies translations of important theological and historical Sikh texts, such as the Suraj Granth. Earlier this year, at the start of lockdown, Jvala Singh released the Suraj podcast, in which he provides short summaries of the chapters within the monumental historical text, the Gur Pratap Suraj Granth. I can't say that word. Written in 1843, written by the great poet Kavi Santokh Singh. The podcast has been received with much admiration from listeners all over the world who've been captivated by Jawala's English commentary and narration on this less known but very valuable text, in which he covers chapter by chapter the stories of the Suraj Granth, first relating to Guru Har Gobind, and specifically starting at when Bidhi Chand sets off to steal 2 horses from the Lahore fort. So that's just a little summary of what it's about. The podcast is available to listen to on SoundCloud and Spotify, and personally it was the highlight of my lockdown period. It ends on these cliffhangers, and it's like Netflix. You can't stop at that one episode. You have to carry on listening to it. It's so good, and I guess that's the mark of a good storyteller as well. His blog Mangalacharan also provides English translations of passages from important Sikh historical texts. Mangalacharan exists to serve as an unfiltered resource through which one can access the treasure trove of knowledge passed down by our ancestors, which has not yet been translated into English. For the past decade, Mangalacharan has provided translations of passages from various scriptures within the Sikh tradition, namely from Circulate Granth, the Dasam Granth, Gobind Gita by Guru Gobind Singh, Kabit Savaiye by Bhai Gurdas Ji, and Bansavli Nama by Kesar Singh Chibbar. In 2019, Jvala Singh published 54 Punjabi Proverbs, which is now an Amazon bestseller. This is the first English translation of some popular and less known kahawats, or proverbs, of the Punjabi language. We will be discussing the origins of this publication this evening and exploring aspects of poetic and literary devices used in Punjabi language. So let's see what Jvala makes of my right here now. Is that all right?
Hey, how's it going?
Is that decent intro? Yeah, I've tried to, everything.
Yeah, so how's it going? It's quite a long intro.
I know. I've spent a lot of time tailoring this to individual people, and I hope that came across for those people that aren't familiar with you. And the aim is that they go and research you, and obviously after this conversation, hopefully they're inspired to do that as well. So when you're ready, we're going to start off with. There's quite a few of you I saw who had joined who have been participating in this South Asian Heritage Month UK series. So you'll be familiar with the format, which is we start with rapid fire round questions, which is just an icebreaker. And it's essentially just a way to, get to know you, Jvala, the person. So let's start. As a researcher, you have to be an avid reader. So which 3 books would you take with you on a desert island?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Yeah, even I wouldn't be.
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with, what I'm currently researching. But I think something that I would take with me would be the Suraj Prakash, on account of it's like gigantic and enormous, and you could be on that island for like 1,000 years and you wouldn't get through it.
You probably just need that one. That would be enough, right? You probably don't need the other 2.
That'd probably be enough. For fun reading, I like Herman Hesse. He's a great writer. But honestly, because my work is so ingrained right now, reading the type of material I need for my research, I would kind of go Suraj Prakash. There's some other great books I'm reading right now. Right under my phone. Anybody who's interested in like the history of India, this is definitely a great book. India and the Persian Age by Richard Eaton. definitely check that book out. It'll give you a lot of context through um, basically how the Persians, or basically what Turks are as well, the
Mhm.
whole Mughal Empire, the context around that. Definitely a good read.
Mm. Okay, yeah. But I think it's fair to say, Suraj Prakash, that'll be enough, like you said.
Really good.
Okay. Which three historical figures, living or dead, would you invite to your dinner party?
Sorry, I had my phone. Which three?
Historical figures, living or dead. I know that's really vague, but I'm leaving that to your imagination. Three historical figures, um, living or dead. Well, that doesn't make sense, obviously. If they're living, they wouldn't be historical, but you get what I'm trying to ask you.
This is not so rapid fire. So sorry. Three historical figures that what?
Let's make it rapid. Three historical figures. Name three off the top of your head.
Oh, that I like. Oh, okay. Well, since we mentioned Suraj Prakash, I go Santokh Singh.
Mm.
I would go. Um, I would go Aurangzeb because I was reading this Persianate book, and then I would go. Just off the top of my head, I don't know, like Fulla Singh Akali,
Wow,
1800s.
what a
Yeah.
table that would be. That would be a table, wouldn't it? Yeah. Your favorite proverb in English and favorite proverb in Punjabi.
Ooh, in English. Um,
Mm.
I guess in Punjabi it's easy one. Akalam bajo khu khali. So akalam bajo without akal, without any type of intellect or skill. Khu khali, the well is always empty.
Mm.
Um, it's kind of a harsh one, I guess, but it kind of illustrates for me to put my effort and I guess my focus into my work. Because without like really digging deep, without trying to use your brains, and we're all educated here in the West, we could do a lot with the material that we have.
Mm.
Without that, the well is always empty. So regardless of how deep that well is, like if you think about it, we have the deepest well ever known that's ever been accessible for people. As if
Mm.
at this point of our lives right now, we have so much access to literature, to writing, even to knowledge about how to decode some of these writings. So, I mean, the resources that we do have is like it's limitless when you compare it to what people used to have. It's
Yeah.
just a matter of we want to dig deep and kind of engage with it. I would say that's my favorite Punjabi. It's one my grandfather used to use a lot.
Mm.
Mythology. In
What about in
English, in English, off the top of my head, I would go something like, a tiger never changes its stripes. I know there's a Punjabi equivalent that I have of
yeah.
that, but
Well, mm.
but a cautionary proverb. But
Okay.
yeah.
We'll go into that because we're obviously going to discuss your book. And finally, which language do you dream in?
Oh, English for sure. Yeah. Growing up, English was I mean, my parents spoke in Punjabi, but I definitely was fond in English. My English is definitely, I write in English, I work in English. A lot of the, emphasis for me to kind of go back into the literature was kind of reclaim that language.
Mm.
Um, it wasn't until I started living in India that I became more proficient in Punjabi.
Mm.
Um, and a lot of my youth, like when I was a teenager, I kind of helped self-taught how to read, right? Before I got formal teaching in how to read. So definitely English is it's my stronger language.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so that bit is over. So hopefully you didn't feel any pressure, and now we can get into the flow of the conversation. But before we do that, I just wanted to establish the difference between a proverb and an idiom, because a lot of people, myself included, I never used to know what the difference was when I was a lot younger. But there is a difference. So a proverb is a saying that usually imparts wisdom. And an example of that would be an apple a day keeps the doctor away, which is one of my favorite ones because that's something my granddad, my nanaji used to say a lot, and I never understood what he was saying, and I was maybe 5 or 6. So that's something that's very dear to me. Too many cooks spoil the broth, and the pen is mightier than the sword. But on that one, too many cooks spoil the broth. There's something very similar in your book, page 50. Anyone who's got their book to hand, page 50 of 54 Punjabi Proverbs. There is a Punjabi proverb very similar to too many cooks spoil the broth. Tija raliya kam galya. When a third person arrives, the task at hand deteriorates. And an idiom now is something which doesn't have any advice attached to it. It's just a phrase or an expression that is metaphorical but without any non-literal meaning. So an example of that would be, oh, it's a piece of cake, meaning that's really easy. Time to hit the sack, meaning to go to bed. Kill two birds with one stone. So obviously it's not literal things, but they're metaphors. So that's the difference. And in Punjabi, proverb is kahavat and idiom is muhavre.
You would also call proverb a khan as well. A khan?
Oh yeah, a khan as well. The other one, yeah. So let's get into this book then, 54 Punjabi Proverbs. Where did the idea stem from to research, collate, and translate these? And then why 54? Because we know there's just a vast, treasure trove of these. How did you condense it to 54, and why did you select these ones? So the idea, and why 54?
Yeah, I'll start with 54 first. I guess it kind of came down to how an Indian, or just anywhere in the West, 108 is very auspicious number. It holds some weight to it. It's kind of heavy, like philosophical, spiritual. And for this, we wanted it to be really lighthearted. We wanted it to be just fun, something you can toss around, making sure grandparents, something you can take, I don't know, to a family event. We didn't know there wouldn't be any family events this year, but it's something that you can kind of just have fun with, right? It's not something that's going to be thick. It's not something that's going to be a long read. So we kind of just went, okay, we should probably go 108. It's like the Eastern thing. And then from 108, we just cut it in half to make it kind of a more fun thing, and just really have to deal with the size. But how I got started with the Proverbs was basically because of my translation work outside of Punjabi literature. And when I was looking at a lot of Braj texts, you would come across these type of proverbs, and so that for me it became a big problem, because when I was translating, and a lot of my work has to deal with translation, it became an issue of, okay, well, I can't translate this literally. If you do literally, it takes it out of context, right? So then what I decided to do was look at, so you can actually find in Punjabi like a Kankosh, like a dictionary of proverbs, and you can find this on Punjab Digital Library. There's other authors. At the top of my book, I reference an author who has made a book. It's actually by Singh. He's put a book out. He was a professor in Punjab. He put a book out on Punjabi as well. So there exists this literature, this whole, quite a lot of books on this, but they're in Punjabi, and because of that, they're inaccessible to the people, like the youth in the West, right? So when I was trying to translate these, I started looking these up, and they were a lot of fun actually. So I started putting them online. People themselves gave me feedback. Other friends gave me feedback that these are great. I should compile these. And once we compiled, we put it in a book format, and then it just went from there. So basically, it came from this need to translate old text, and you'd find these proverbs in there. People use these proverbs. I've spoken about this before, where Guru Singh is using some of these proverbs in not only Suraj Prakash, but other historical texts. There's also reference to these type of proverbs being used by Guru Singh. So it just became a necessity for me for my work. And then from that, I didn't know that it would be such a fun thing that people could use with their families. People started throwing them around.
I was saying, I don't know if you caught the introduction. I was saying that it's such a simple look how thin it is, right? Not very dense at all, but and it's very simple in terms of its formatting as well. So the Punjabi proverb, transliteration, but it had the ability to just connect people from different generations, and I think that's the beauty of language, and the fact that it was translated into English, because it's something that you said hadn't been translated to English before, and now we can understand it. This is in a tongue that the diaspora can understand, and there's so much wisdom that that you can gain from this. And as I said earlier, the English proverb, too many cooks spoil broth, well, the Punjabi equivalent is here as well. So you can make those links, and it became quite fun for people, isn't it? And the stories connected to their parents and grandparents. So I'm sure you didn't think about that when you were putting this book together. For you, as part of it was just connected to your research. But but look at the impact that it had on cross generations.
It's interesting.
Language is so powerful like that.
The feedback I got, and for those who are watching this in UK, it's going to be available on UK Amazon in like a week or two. We're just getting that set up.
That was your special announcement.
We were supposed to do a special
announcement. Yeah, I said that you were going to do it. So that's the special announcement, that it's unavailable because it did so well. It sold out so quickly, but it's available this week now?
Yeah, it should be towards the end of this week, maybe early next week. For those who really want a reminder, just send me a message with your email, and I'll send out an email when it's available. We really hadn't anticipated the demand that so stocking the books was an issue out in England, which is great. We really appreciate the support. We really didn't understand the type of feedback that we would get. For example, like when people started taking these books home and saying it to their grandparents, I kind of didn't realize that these were very commonly said, even in like populations that were like not as educated. Like my grandmothers were not educated, yet a lot of these proverbs, they would be like, "Oh, your grandma used to say this a lot," and there would always be kind of like a funny story surrounding it.
Which one about your mum and dad, right? A story which has a proverb that contains a proverb about when your mum and dad met or got engaged, I think, right?
Yeah, basically when my grandparents on my mom's side went to go see my dad to see if he was a suitable match and all that typical arranged marriage style, back in the late 70s in England. And, they went to go see him. They came back home. My mom wasn't there. So my grandparents are telling my mom, what kind of man he is and stuff. And so my mom was asking, okay, like, how was he? And my grandfather, my Nanaji, was kind of making fun of my dad and my mom at the same time, saying something along the lines of, "Oh, well, you would like him a lot because, he kind of wears ripped jeans, as was the style. He wears ripped jeans like you, basically." My grandmother was kind of sticking up for my dad there, and my grandmother kind of chimed in saying, "Sherande muh tote nahi hunde." So like a tiger's face is never washed, and meaning like it doesn't matter. Like a tiger's accomplished in all these other aspects. It doesn't need to like
be presentable. Yeah.
So that kind of won my mom over, grandfather over, and then whatever, they got married next week. So.
Yeah. No, but that is just so typical. Like you said, most of the people were illiterate. Women, they had these, figuratively speaking, in their pockets, available at hand, right? They knew it was just part of their memory. And something I wanted to share, my personal story, growing up. So I'm one of 5 sisters, and I used to hear this one, which is in your book. It's on page 21, and I was really happy when I saw it there. I'd forgotten about this proverb, but again, like I said, it transported me back to my childhood. And my mom used to say this all the time when we used to say, "Oh, you favoritize one sister over the other," and silly things we say as children. And she would give this response back. She'd say, "Hath diyan panje ungla ikko jiyan nahi hundiyan," meaning the 5 fingers of a hand are never all the same. And the translation here is, while one's fingers all work together to accomplish a task, they are of different sizes and strength. This proverb speaks to the need of recognizing diversity. So our mom would say that to us, and we'd think, why are you giving us these riddles? We don't understand. And she'd show us, like, 5 fingers, they're not the same. I need all of them. I can't do without one of them. And that's something that came to her in
Yeah.
trying to explain to us that we are all important to her. And when I showed my mom this book, she said, "Dekha, you remember I used to say this to you? It's not just me. This is what we all used to feel and say. And there's so many more like that. But and I'm sure, hopefully when I disable the comments, we can see other people that they can share their own personal stories and proverbs. But just want to move on now. You touched on the fact that proverbs, they're really important part of any language. You get African proverbs, Jewish proverbs. This is not something particular to English or Punjabi language, of course, right? But I just wanted to expand on Waris Shah, the author of the epic saga Heer, Waris Shah's Heer. And Waris Shah's Heer is a treasure trove of Punjabi phrases, idioms, and proverbs. If you've read it, but there are English translations available. And what's really important about a proverb, generally, a proverb gives you insight into a particular culture, right? And Waris Shah's Heer does that through his proverbs. So I've got a few here that I just wanted to share. They're not all in Punjabi because I couldn't find the Punjabi translation. But Waris Shah's Heer was written in the 1700s in Punjab. So it gives a very detailed depiction through the proverbs and the idioms and the sayings. It gives a very detailed depiction of life in Punjab in the 1700s, the social customs and norms, the social ills, the political situation, and the patriarchal society. And that is what most of the proverbs point to. So I'll give you a few examples here. There was one, this is an English translation. "Why have you cut off the nose of the family and covered us with disgrace?" This is a proverb that has been said to Heer, the female protagonist. "Why have you cut off the nose of the family and covered us with disgrace?" This is a famous Urdu Punjabi proverb. I couldn't get the Punjabi proverb, unfortunately. But what it means is you're dishonoring the family. That's essentially what it means. And again, like I said, the context, the backdrop of Waris Shah's Heer, it's written in a very patriarchal time. And women were seen as subordinate. They were seen as, a woman carries the honor of the family. So this is pointing to that. So we get an insight into that cultural situation. Another one, Waris Shah says, "Na adata jandiyan ne pave katiye poriyan poriyan ji," meaning a man never abandons his habits, even if he's hacked to pieces. That reminded me of a line in Gurbani, "Purja purja kat mare kaguno chade khet." Which I think, obviously, this is 1700s, so that might have been a proverb that existed in the Guru's times, and Waris Shah just adapted it. "Sis diya par sirar na diya," right? That's another one.
That's something I wanted to mention as well. The one previously, this is something that I find so interesting, is that these idioms use across not only different languages, not only different communities, but different literary styles as well and genres. So, like you mentioned that one about getting cut up in different pieces. There's a line written by Guru Gobind Singh in Vichitra Natak where he says, "Sis par sir na diya." He's talking about his father there. When he was basically imprisoned by Aurangzeb, and Guru Gobind Singh describing, the imprisonment and kind of what happened there. He says that, his father gave his head, "Sis diya," but sir na diya. He didn't give away this sir, this secret, because basically the context of that was Aurangzeb was saying, "Okay, if you perform a miracle, then I'll let you live. If you don't, you're going to be executed." And we know from historical writings contemporary of that time that this was something Aurangzeb was doing, was kind of going around to religious leaders that he thought were against his camp, basically, and basically executing them under this pretense, right?
Yeah.
So anyways, the point is Guru Gobind Singh used this line, this idiom that, one would give their head, wouldn't give like their inner knowledge, their inner secrets, their inner power, their inner ability, right? They would keep that to themselves. And Waris Shah uses the exact same idiom. He uses it in a different context. When he's using it some 50, 60 years later, and this is something I'm going to post on my Twitter as well, kind of showing how the literature that we do have, like Gurbani that we do have, utilizes idioms, proverbs, literary styles, poetics of the time to convey something profound, right? But what Waris is using, how he's using it, it's a context, it's a conversation back and forth between Ranja and Heer's sister or sister-in-law. And yeah, and they're back and forth, and she is suspecting Ranja as, having this relationship with Heer, and basically he says that line, the line being that, a beloved would give it, but, rather than telling on like his beloved, like giving up that secret of so we can see this idiom being used in a variety of different contexts, right? Across time, as well as across literary styles. Obviously, they were not, of the same genre. But what is interesting is Guru Gobind Singh did write in a Kissa style literature genre, and the Triceleb is one of Guru Gobind Singh's largest compositions, and that is the Triceleb is literally a literary genre style that has been before and after Guru Gobind Singh's version. This is something that Guru Gobind Singh himself in those charitas writes about Heer Ranja, writes about Mirza Sahib. Like there's a lot of different things that he talks in there. There's 405 tales.
So amazing, right? Because these are, he's making references to that culture, to that time. So it's a no-brainer, right? That he's going to use these. If we think about the Guru Granth Sahib or any of the Granths, it's poetry. So of course they're going to encapsulate these literary and poetic devices, but we don't see it like that until you deconstruct and analyze it. You begin to see it, and this parallel that you made between the proverb in Waris Shah and how Guru Gobind Singh used it, so beautiful. And I remember when you shared that with me, I was just like mind blown. I get excited over little things like that, especially the language. And I was just, it's just so beautiful because we see them as separate things. We see the Granth maybe as just a religious, which is not. It's a scriptural text, but that's how we see it. It's just dogma, and it's not that. But when you really look at it and examine it, you could just look at one line of Gurbani and take hours just understanding the poetry, which was something we're going to go on to actually with a particular chand of the Dasam Granth. But I just wanted to, and I'm glad you mentioned the Punjabi Kisse. That was actually one of my questions, that the Kissa is a very famous romantic tragedy genre. Like you mentioned, Mirza Saiba, Heer Ranja, Laila Majnu, Soni Malwal, Sikh, and their inspiration is derived from Persian sources. And obviously Waris Shah, he is the most popular one of all of them. There's Kissa Puran Bhagat as well. So
right.
And I'd love to talk on these one day as well. But time is mocking us, so we will continue. So there's something. So I was doing some research and I came across this researcher whose name is Lubna Aklak Khan. And she's done, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Jvala, but she's done a thesis on Punjabi proverbs and gender, the construction of multiple identities. I just wanted to have a conversation with you about this because there is something in your book, well, two things, I think, in your book, two references to people in terms of their gender identity and role. And what's really amazing, sorry, I just looking at my notes. We were talking about Gurbani. Just wanted to share some proverbs. Ape bij ape hi khao. In Japji side, like you say what you read, and Aaron mat ved hatiyar. These are like proverbs and idioms in Gurbani. There's so many more, but these are the two that I wanted to share. But what I would like to expand on, my favorite Bani is that of Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji. I know you shouldn't have a favorite, but I do. And I like the themes that he explores because he explores the transient nature of life. And that's something, there's a proverb that mentions the transient nature of life in here, which is on page 26, Khedden de din char, which you have there. Page 26, guys, if you have the book, I feel like a teacher now. Page 26, Khedden de din char. Play only lasts for 4 days. Play meaning life. Play is an analogy for life. That's it. And you've written here, Jvala, this is a sobering proverb which speaks to the transient nature of happiness, only lasts for a short time. One should not try to hold on to such experience. I've heard this growing up. My mom used to say this, life is very short. And like I said, Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji's Bani echoes this a lot. Slok Mahalla Nama particularly, Beet Jeh, Janam Akajre, which is not Slok Mahalla Nama. Baru ki peet jaise basuda ko raj hai, meaning that life is like a wall of sand. Like you try to hold on to it, and the tighter grip you try to have on sand, the quicker it slips away. Chin chin kar gayo kal taise jaat aaj hai. Life is slipping away moment by moment. One of my favorite ones from Slok Mahalla Nama, Sukh mein bahut sangi paye, dukh mein sang na koi. And in English, growing up, I heard, my family, my sisters, my mom, they would say, people are only there for you in times of happiness. They're not there for you in sadness. And I remember when I came across this in Slok Mahalla Nama, Sukh mein bahut sangi paye, dukh mein sang na koi, I was just overwhelmed that this was an observation that the Guru had made. And that is what the Guru Granth Sahib is, isn't it? It's not a rule book. There is wisdom, universal wisdom in there, such as this. Jag supana arpekhna aise jag ko jaan. Understand, Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji saying to the mortal, understand that life is just a dream, right? Did you want to touch on that at all?
Yeah, it's actually something that's interesting. I find interesting a lot. Guru Hargobind, he writes about this. Actually, if somebody wants to look at some historical references and good historical books, there's one by J.S. Grewal, and I forget the co-author's name off the top of my head. It's called Sikh History from Persian Sources. It actually mentions who goes and visits Guru Hargobind, and he questions Guru Hargobind, okay, what do you think, like, basically, what is the core of the religious belief? How do you see the world? And he gives this answer that, life is like a dream, and reality is, and, obviously, Guru Tegh Bahadur is the youngest out of Guru Hargobind's family. It's his son, right? So he also conveyed that to Guru Tegh Bahadur. Guru Tegh Bahadur was writing this, and yeah, I mean, it's an idea that stems all the way back in Indian philosophy for a long time. The concept of the world is like a dream, and it's transient, and even though actually there's a lot of if you go on Mangalacharn as well, there's some passages I translate that give context to this about stories about Guru Hargobind talking about this idea. But yeah, I mean, it's a very, very common idea, conception about the world being transient and not to be caught up in it, and because it vanishes quite quickly. There's like deeper meanings. If you want to go even deeper, not that the world is just transient, but also the idea about what is the self. So when you think about a dream, what's happening in a dream? You are manifesting the dream, right? You yourself are creating this dream while you are the actor in the dream. Like you have created the entire environment, right? And you've situated yourself in that dream, not knowing that you've created that entire environment, not knowing that you're actually subconsciously creating the other people in that environment, orchestrating what they're saying is. But in that dream, you don't think you're doing that. You don't realize that you are creating that. Right? You don't realize that speaking to you, that person is also you. Like you've created that, right? In that way, it is also an analogy about the conception of the world as well. Like there's an in Sikh philosophy as well as other philosophies, there's the idea that what is underneath us, what we are all standing upon, the adhishtan substratum of the entire world is this one, one being, this one energy, right? And we will emerge basically, right? And we are like the of an ocean, right? But that ocean is all one, right? So, and there's different layers you can take this analogy and kind of look at it and have fun with it. But it's the construct that's utilized a lot in Gurbani, this idea that, that it is 4 days as well. Four is a very interesting number that people in Punjab use, like, char akar par ke, right? They say that as well, like, oh, you read only 4 letters and you think you're like, such a great scholar. It's something that's good.
Yeah. Bulle Shah says that as well. One of his Kafis, I can't remember, but yeah, it's very similar to what you just said there. Yeah, and 4 and 5. 5 is always very symbolic of a peer, or like the Panch Pyare as well. So there's something there. Maybe we can explore the numbers another time. Not something I'm an expert on, but just continuing with the theme of gendered proverbs. Page 29 of your book. Page 29. Changa puttar ikko sujag ki karna gadyan da vag. Having one good son is equivalent to a sacrifice, as in very valuable. What is any use of having a herd of donkeys? This proverb is said to explain to listeners the importance of quality, i.e. one good son, over quantity. So I just want to bring it back to Lubna's thesis, where she's exploring gendered proverbs. And there's this idea that Punjabi proverbs, you can sort of break them down into gender roles. So a man is typically viewed in a very positive, very good light, whereas a woman is generally viewed as insignificant and very subordinate and villainous sometimes as well. So I just want to give a few examples. So this one in your book is hailing the son, and the son is someone that is hailed, as is the father. But if we look at, I think you have one here about father as well. Yes, page 20 about the dad. I'll just give that example before I move on. So chacha ik pyo, so daru ik kyo. 100 uncles are worth one father, 100 bottles of alcohol are worth one of ghee. A classical Punjabi sentiment regarding the priceless value of both a father and ghee. So Lubna has also spoken about this, and she says that when we look at women are sort of portrayed in various lights according to their gender roles. So a mother is always held in high regard. Mama Tandiya Chama. There's one about similar to a verse in the Quran where Jannat or heaven lies at the feet of the mother, whereas a mother-in-law is never portrayed in a good light, which is that speaks of the cultural situation, which is still very relevant, right? Sastati nukapati, meaning if the mother-in-law is fiery, the daughter-in-law is equally she's gonna bite back, basically. And there were just a few that I wanted to go over. So women generally are portrayed as quarrelsome, they're portrayed as unintelligent, and just like a trophy wife. Aurta kara diya daulta, just treasures to be kept at home. And wives are typically seen as troublemakers and cause of grief and worries. Navi jutti, navi ran, dove dukh dende. A new wife and a new shoe both irritate. And the English sort of equivalent would be, like, oh, the old ball and chain, right? You never really associate that in a good light. And when someone's getting married, that's what we say. We say, oh, the old ball and chain. This is the Punjabi or Urdu equivalent to that. Then we've got a bride, a daughter-in-law. She's seen as evil, who needs to work hard to please her in-laws. Mothers, again, mama de pera het jannat hai. Ma razi ta rab razi. If you please your mom, it's akin to the pleasure of God. Mothers are given importance because obviously the ability to procreate, but a mother-in-law, she's presented in a completely face-threatening manner. So these are just a few examples that I wanted to share. And a daughter is seen in a very good light, whereas a daughter-in-law is not seen in a good light. And this is just very typical of, not typical, but I guess it just sheds light on the patriarchal society in which these were probably constructed, which brings me on to our next question. How do you think proverbs circulate? And is there space for new proverbs to come into our culture? How does a proverb stick or establish itself? Just a few minutes on that, and then we can move on to 8:15 already. Wow. I want to just touch on the Guru Granth Sahib, Dasam Granth, and then questions.
Yeah, just to kind of talk about some of the points you were making before. We do have to understand where proverbs come from, how they arise, how they get used. And we do have to be mature in understanding that there are portions of our culture that are not good, you know, and we understand this, right? The idea from the book was to present some of the gold, you know, that is circulated, you know, amongst our culture. Because we do have a lot of gold. We do have a lot of good, you know, very wise sayings, principles, virtues, you know, points to be, you know, cautious when engaging with life. There's a lot of good, right? And alongside of it, you know, there's a lot of bad proverbs as well that get circulated. So in the book, when I did a talk with Amandi Madra, he was trying to get me to say some proverbs that didn't make the cut. But to be honest, I really didn't want to give those any light anyways. I mean, people who want to see some of that stuff, they can look to the Punjabi proverb dictionaries and kind of go through them. There are proverbs that get circulated because, you know, a large portion of the community uses them. That doesn't mean they're great, but, you know, that speak to, you know, caste disparity, speak to caste social structures, you know, about Jats perhaps, about other castes as well, Brahmins, that speak negatively about women. There are these, you know, just like in every culture, there's good and bad as well, right? And, you know, a lot of, just because a saying gets circulated by a lot of people, you know, does that mean that that's a good saying? You know, of course not. But what I did in my book is I kind of dug my hand in all these proverbs and I took out the ones that I thought I liked and thought I wanted to share, and I thought that it would be good to have these go forward with the community and the culture. You know, is in cultures and in society, there's always an up and down. You know, values gain prominence and then they, you know, lose prominence. And, you know, cultures go from being progressive to being conservative. And, you know, sometimes the demons in the culture, they get nurtured and they become bigger and, you know, they die out. So it's natural to see these when you look at Punjabi proverbs, say that, okay, you know, met some proverbs and they speak negatively towards women. Does that mean all of Punjabi culture is negative and bad? Of course. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
and just like ourselves, you know, we can look at cultures just like that as well. We have many negative traits, negative habits, negative ideas, negative perceptions that we work of and that we are constantly trying to overcome. And, you know, we shouldn't ignore those. But if we're trying to put our best foot forward and trying to preserve some of the gold in the past, I did not include those type of proverbs. But you're right, there are some, like when you mention some of those, there are some good proverbs in there. Like I'm remembering when Guru Tegh Bahadur leaves Amritsar and he's not treated very well by Heer and these people that were controlling the Darbar Sahib at that time. The women of the city took care of him. And there's a line he's noted in saying, Maya Rab Rajaya. You know, like mothers are like comforting quilts, basically, right?
Yeah.
For anybody that wants to look that up, that's in Satugali Taksal Steek of Guru Granth Sahib. I'll post that actually on my story for you guys. But yeah, so there's, you know, there's good proverbs and there's bad proverbs and all alike. And yeah, how they become used, how they get utilized is honestly just the fact that a lot of people use them. You know, they find it useful, like these proverbs that
word of mouth, right?
Yeah, you know, and it's just kind of like myth as well. Like what myth? I find proverbs interesting because they are like myths in a way. They're a way to package an idea, a principle, a virtue, a value, and in an interesting and in a fun and a playful and in a way that engages with memory. Is so that people can utilize it, right? Whereas people might look at mythology to say, "Oh, of course this didn't happen." Well, you know, they're looking at it superficially, and underneath that, there's a point of value. There's a virtue there. There's something to tell you. So that's why I find it so interesting. But sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm just conscious of time. If anyone has any question, I mean, we wanted to go into the Gurbani, but if you have questions, please share them. Otherwise, I will ask my questions. But yeah, we've got 10 minutes. Oh, okay. myself. Sarfa karke sutti atta. Okay, this needs to be in Punjabi. Sarfa karke sutti atta khagiye kutti. Oh no, okay, I'm not reading that out loud. I think that's rude. There's a atta. Okay, yeah, this is definitely a bit inappropriate, so I'm not going to read that out loud. But it's there if you want to read it. Two proverbs, but yeah, okay. Thank you for that contribution, Sunny. So I just wanted to talk about the sort of poetic devices in Gurbani for the next 5 minutes, really. I would love to continue. I mean, we'll see how it goes, but yeah, 8:30 is the cut-off time. Maybe we need to do another one, part 2. Question. Muhavre and Akan both were my favorite topics in Punjab school textbooks. Do you use them also for research? Thank you, Harfate, for that question.
So I got this message as well that, in Punjab, they do still teach these, and that's fine. My audience really wasn't for people living in Punjab. Like, a lot of them still use these proverbs, commonly. And it's good that they're teaching them in schools, and they're carrying it forward. This book was simply for people in the West who didn't understand. Like, a lot of people my age, growing up with, they may understand the words in Punjabi. They're like, but when they try to piece that together, they don't understand what that means. So a lot of it was bring the context and putting that into English for people that were not proficient in Punjabi to the extent that they understood what proverbs were in Punjab. So, but yeah, people do in Punjab. People are taught this, and people still use them.
Thank you. And Sunny just clarified it's using Gutti as a dog, but not swearing. Thank you, Sunny, for that. My question, Jvala, something I did want to explore was, so I recently shared a chand, Uchang Priyat chand, verse from Dasam Granth, which is Jagardang Nagardang Bagardang Baje. And I just wanted to touch on this because you shared something. I thought it was unique to Guru Gobind Singh, but of course, a lot of these things are not unique, just like how rags have been borrowed from Hindustani classical music, with the exception of Jai Javanti that I know from the top of my head. Well, no, but that's Jai Javanti in Hindustani classical music. The same way dohiras, they existed. Kabir used dohas, which are pretty much the same thing. And Jagardang Nagardang I love because it uses onomatopoeia and alliteration. I love the way it just rolls off the tongue. Jagardang Nagardang Bagardang Baje Gagardang Gaji Mahagaje Gaje. I'm going to read it so people understand. They can see the alliteration and onomatopoeia. Kagardang Kati Katari Kadakan, Tagardang Tiran to Pakam Kadakan, Sagardang Surang, Kagardang Kopang, Pagardang Parmang, Ranang Pagropang, Sagardang Sastram, Chagardang Chare, Bagardang Beering, Dagardang Dakare. I love saying that. I love the way this rolls off my tongue. And you can hear and see the onomatopoeia, alliteration, and it's evoking that martial spirit. But you shared something recently on Instagram that this is very typical of war poetry. If you just want, I'd let you expand on that.
Yeah, so Guru Gobind Singh is writing in Braj meters there. That's Bhajang Pariya Chand is like a meter that has, a certain construction, which I go into. And basically, we got a big comment there as well. But basically, in regards to that, these, like the type of chands and the type of, devices that Guru Gobind Singh were using, like people had used it before. It's in Rama Charitamanas by Tulsidas. It's in other texts. Mean that takes away from Guru Gobind Singh's writings. Guru Gobind Singh was writing in a style that people, if they heard it, they could understand. But he was writing it so exquisitely. He was so good at it. He was so proficient in writing in that style that he was jumping into different genres of writing, and he was excelling in different genres of writing. That was a particular genre of poetry that people have written before, and people have written after as well, right? But my research into that is to understand the writings of Guru Gobind Singh. You also have to understand the context of, from where, those writings came from, right? Like what's surrounding it, who are writing in that style, how are they writing in meter, and then comparing it, because obviously any type of comparison naturally includes like it should include examination of other writing, like who else is writing in that style, how are they writing it, but like that style of writing of war poetry where you're using all these different literary devices, and this is something that I post about regularly now about poetics. Guru Singh was writing it not only in Raj, he was writing it in Punjabi, Chandi Diwar is written in Punjabi. He was writing, if you look in Google, there's like Rekhta as well, which is like, Farsi, and then full Urdu poetry. He's writing across languages, across literary styles, across genres, and excelling in all of those, which is proof to the pudding is why did these texts retain so much importance over time? Why did these texts have that pull? And I think when you jump into understanding the context, then you get a better idea about, oh, this is why this is so amazing. People did write in the past like that, and people did write in the future like that. But by examining both of those sides, we can kind of get a clearer insight as to why that poetry is so amazing, right? Like why it invokes such a martial spirit, and the proof is in the pudding when you see how did he get so many people to rebel, right?
Exactly. Just going to ask you, Jvala, there's a few more questions we've got here, a few more questions I wanted to ask. If I end this live here and restart it, are you able to continue for another 20 minutes? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay, because I want to save this live, so I'm just going to end it now, so I can share it to my Instagram live. I don't want it to cut out like it normally does. So if you can rejoin in 30 seconds and we'll continue. And for those that have asked these questions, if you have the time, please could you rejoin and share the questions there, because we could go on talking for such a long time, and I want everyone to have the opportunity to ask their questions as well. So obviously 1 hour doesn't do this conversation justice. I'll end it now, but please rejoin in about a minute or so. See you on the other side. That just goes to show, Jvala, how popular this conversation is. Thanks to everyone who's rejoined. I'm going to leave the comments enabled for those that wanted to ask those questions we didn't get round to. I've just shared the previous hour onto IGTV, and I wanted to make sure it was within the hour. Otherwise, this conversation you can't come back to, and I want people to come back to it if they haven't been able to join this live. So we'll pick up from where we left off. So we were discussing the poetic literary devices of Dasam Granth, in particular this verse, Jagardang Nagardang. And you were elaborating that this style of war poetry existed before and continued after. I know after there was the Jangnama that was written, a genre of historical poetic writing. I think it was written during or after the First Anglo-Sikh War. So yeah, these descriptions of war have always existed, right? Providing insight into that time. But I think even Jagardang Nagardang, for example, isn't just about the physical battle. I think it's about the mental battle, right? That we all face, the conflict in our own mind. But the actual composition, it does talk about, it's very graphic. It talks about the different types of swords or weapons that cut through flesh and bone, not for the faint-hearted, this kind of poetry. So yeah, if you just want to continue with that, Jvala, we'll wait for whoever had the questions to join what you were saying about this warlike genre.
Yeah, much of Guru Gobind Singh's writings can be understood when put into the context of, what was he writing for? Who was the audience? What was the context of the time? What was he trying to inspire? Because all of those things matter when trying to look at any type of literature, right? So that particular quote that you mentioned is a portion out of, I believe it's Chandi Diwar, so like the stories related to the goddess. And we got a message about personification. And a lot of myth could be understood as personification as well. Like they're taking an idea, they're taking a Shakti, like an energy, and what they're doing is that, like, they're creating a whole mythology around it. So they're creating this idea that, it's a person and they go into battle and they're cutting different people up. And they're kind of using that as a way to convey ideas, to invoke certain emotions. And this is something that we have to understand about their writings is that poetry by nature is designed to evoke emotion, and is designed to tug at your heartstrings, if it were. And we have to kind of realize that they're doing that while throwing in philosophy, right? It's not
Yeah.
poetry, right? It's not, they're trying to convey something while they're doing it. And I think testament to, their writings in Gurbani, that when you look at other communities that were writing similar writings at that time, where are they? Right? Are they still around? Do people still read those type of texts? In Gurbani, you have these texts read every day. Across the world, they're being read, right? Read by almost millions, more than millions of people, right? So, it's a testament, even though we don't nowadays have a good grasp on the poetics, the majority of the readers who are reading it, obviously there's and people in, learning institutions and stuff like that do understand it. Even though we do not have a grasp on the poetics and stuff, it still is leaving an effect. Like you said, like when you're reading it, you feel, okay, I'm getting pumped up here. And
gears me up for nothing. But yeah, when I was sing that, when I sing anyway, whether that's Kirtan or Punjabi folk or Sufi, I imagine my surroundings, and the words help you to do that. Obviously, that's what they're intended to do. They consciously curated, right, to have that desired effect, as is music, as it's rag. But yeah, when I hear that, even just reading, I wasn't singing, I was just reading it. It was jigging me up. I was feeling empowered. And there's quite a few people, when I shared that on our Instagram page, just a short trailer, a lot of people who hadn't even heard of that Barney, they felt G'd up. And I got so many messages from people saying, I don't know, but I just feel like I'm ready to take on the day. Now, we're not going in the contemporary world, we're not really going into physical battle anymore. So how is something like that relevant, would you say? How is this kind of war genre relevant to today, in your opinion?
For the longest time, people have used this analogy about war, not only in an external way, but in an internal way as well. For example, one of the oldest we have in India is this idea of two armies facing off. One army is the army of mole, of attachment, of illusion. And one army is the army of the big, discerning intellect. And these armies have all the virtues on one side and have all the vices on another side. And they battle. And this battle is happening, this war is happening within everybody. It's within the self of everybody. And there's constantly this battle happening. And each virtue, each vice, they have their own characteristics. They have their own advantages, disadvantages in war. They have their own weapons. They have their own enemies and who they're going to take out. And this is how Guru Gobind Singh actually writes in some of his poetry as well. If you look at his portion related to Rudra Avtar, this comes after Chobi Satar. There's a section in Dasam Granth where Guru Gobind Singh is using this idea that there's an internal battle happening. And within oneself, there's all these different vices and virtues, and they fight each other. And, they're not fighting each other, just, it's quite a sophisticated layout of the land. How Santok, how, let's say, what would you call that in English? Basically contentment. How Santok, how contentment is fighting with lobh, right? Greed. And, how the different virtues like is fighting with vastu vichar, so desire is fighting against, contemplation of things. And basically how they fight against each other is a very sophisticated way of drawing that out in poetics. And people use these type of, people would call it vir rasi, heroic spirit. That's the main emotion that is kind of evoked in a lot of Guru Gobind Singh's poetry. People use that emotion not only for an exterior battle, but also interior as well. Like so, they will use that type of vigor and that type of energy to calm the mind as well, to kind of put it to peace, to understand that, there's also vices and there's also enemies within ourselves as well. When we think about, if somebody, had done something stupid, and that's upset us. Like, what is upsetting us? There's something inside us that's potent to be like, oh, you should be upset. We use that vigor and we use that energy to calm ourselves internally, to crush that demon that we have. So people, yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So even in the works of, we can say, and this is another beautiful thing about Guru Gobind Singh's poetry is that, Gurbani, is that he'll use meters that are typically used for martial poetry. Totakshan, for example. Totakshan, the rhythm of it is it gives this idea that there's kind of a galloping happening with a chariot or a horse in battle because of the way the beats, the stress syllable on a certain point, which is a very sophisticated way to write poetry. It's very difficult to write that type of poetry.
Even Pujang Priyat Chand, the one that I was that I mentioned, Pujang Priyat Chand, Pujang is a snake, isn't it? So when you read it, it's like the quick movement of a snake. What's this one that you said? It's called.
We can use that as well. Pujang Priyat Chand is a shan which has 20 syllables per line, per bar. And within that bar, basically, it's all constructed of, it's called a Triceleb Construction. There's 3 syllables to it. It goes long, it goes short, long, long. It's called a yagan. And basically, you just put short, long, long 4 times. So it goes short, long, long, short, long, long, short, long, long, short, long. And it becomes like you're kind of like swimming across one side to another.
Snake,
is like that kind of evokes a certain kind of like snake-like pattern, right? Which is how the meter gets its name. Pujang meaning snake, Priyat, right?
There's another one, Jvala. I can't remember the top of my head. Is it Jatari Chand? There's one which is like the marching. It mirrors the movement of a marching army. Is it Jatari Chand now? Or is it a different one? I don't know off the top of my head.
Totakshan, that the galloping. But a lot of meters, they give off certain rhythms and certain patterns that evoke a certain type of poetry, right? Savo Chand is another one, which is very quick. There's basically there's just a short, long, long, I believe, twice per bar. So it's very short and it's very to the point. Like one of Guru Gobind Singh's, when he's describing actually when he wins a battle, Ranung Jeet Aaye, Jang Jeet Gaye, Kirpa Kal Keri, Pai Jeet Meri, lines along those lines. It's very short and very to the point, and just it hammers home, and people are singing along when they're reciting this type of poetry, this type of Gurbani. It evokes, very strong emotion, right? And when you look at the context of what he was doing at the time, it's no wonder that the people were so amped up and were seen and written about, even outside of our history, as warriors who could, face up against, 10 people per one person, right?
You mentioned about the internal conflict. Even, these are themes that the Gita addresses as well, right? It's not on face value. It's a war between these two families, Kauravas and Pandavas, but it's actually about that internal battle that we have, right? And that's why that kind of war genre or martial poetry is still relevant today, because this is what the Adi Granth is about, which encapsulates Shant Bani, Shant Ras, like you said. Dasam Bani is Bir Ras, evokes that martial warrior spirit. The Guru Granth Sahib addresses the issues of mind. We talk about mental health now. It's something that's always existed, hence why everything always comes back to the man, whether that is Dasam Bani or Adi Granth as well. I wanted to actually share something. You know what? actually, forget me asking question. There was a question here. Mehtab Singh said, there's that question. What books do you recommend in learning Sikh history, as well as books explaining various poetic devices in both Adi Granth Sahib and Dasam Bani?
Ooh, so history-wise,
Yeah, learning Sikh history.
yeah, it's a very tough one, and it's something that I find it difficult to give recommendations right now because for those who don't know, and a lot of the impetus, so kind of the driving force behind my work is to uncover works of history in the Sikh tradition that came before the British. So for those who don't know about the impact that the British had on Sikh history, Sikh philosophy, Sikh culture, it was quite significant. And we have to be very mindful of that. There's quite a colonial impact when we talk about Sikh history. So I am very cautious about recommending Sikh history books that came after that. A lot of it's tainted with kind of the British kind of outlook on life, whether it be philosophically, culturally. So a lot of my work kind of uncovering the texts that came before the British. So Suraj Prakash was the gold standard prior to the British. This was written in like 1843. It was completed. It probably took more than a decade to write. And I find that those type of works so interesting because they were written without the colonial impact. So if you want to look, actually, some of these works have been translated into English, and those I would recommend. So if somebody's looking at the history of the Sikh Missal period, for example, Pant Prakash by Ratan Singh Pangu has been translated into English by various people. You can kind of just Google that. You can find PDFs online. Just search Pant Prakash English. You should be able to find it, a PDF on Google. That's something that you can, I mean, it only covers history from Guru Gobind Singh onwards, and kind of like the history of, the struggles of the Khalsa up until they attained Raj from Ranjit Singh. That's look at history-wise, but in terms of Sikh history itself, I think we have a lot of work to do in uncovering kind of pre-colonial texts that give a different insight as to what was the history before the British came. How did we talk about the gurus? What were the norms at that time? So that's my suggestion. Historically, in terms of poetic meters, there's quite a few books that are written in Punjabi that talk about poetic meters. Granth Singh Nabha has a book that talks about Gurbani poetic meters. That name escapes me. Pandit Kartar Singh Thakha has written Guru Kavya Darshan. Again, it's in very difficult Punjabi for most people. There's one by Kothaguru. His name is Balwant Singh Kothaguru. He has written a commentary on a text written in the early 1700s on poetics, and that's a poetic manual. The manual is very useful, but it doesn't fill in a lot of gaps that somebody would kind of need to know before writing their own poetry, before writing their own chants. So that's something to be aware of. But if you can get your hand on that, it's very useful. Just something I'll throw out there that speak about Roop Deep Pingal. I've seen that Resham Singh joined here as well. So Balwant Singh Kothaguru writes that the person who wrote that commentary about that poetic manual, he's basically a Gurpai. He's basically like, he learned from the same teacher that Guru Gobind Singh learned from. So Guru Gobind Singh learned from somebody who taught him Braj, Farsi. That same person who wrote that poetic manual, he also learned from that same teacher. So reading that book, reading that commentary about Roop Deep Pingal, that steek, is very useful, and it's definitely a must-have if you're looking at Gurbani. I'll post photos of that in.
I was going to say, maybe at the end of this, if you just give me a list, I can share them on my page as well, and you can share them too. There's another question here, Jvala. Would you consider putting out a short course on some of the history? I mean, you have your mangalacharan.com blog anyway. But yeah.
A short course this is the thing, is that you know, for people that want to listen to the stories about Guru Hargobind, they can go to the podcast. The Suraj podcast is basic.
Amazing.
This podcast is, you know, I'm going chapter by chapter through the stories of Guru Hargobind from a text called the Suraj Prakash, which was the gold standard of historical text in the 1800s. Continues to be in the 1900s. People still read this every day in the major takhats in India. It's even in the diaspora. People are even now translating it. I saw that Resham Singh joined. Resham Singh and Jeevanpal Singh are doing amazing work out in England. They're part of this group called the Bhai Gurdas Trust. They have put out portions of Guru Nanak's history in English. So if anybody actually has a recommendation, I should have mentioned as well, if anybody wants to read the history of Guru Nanak, I'll give you a link that I have to share. Bhai Gurdas Education. They're based in England, so it will be easy for the English people to get copies of this text. It's translation of the history of Guru Nanak out of Santokh Singh's writing. Santokh Singh is the person who wrote Suraj Prakash. So that's a must-have. We're looking at history of Guru Nanak. We're looking at history of Guru, then the podcast. Regarding a short course, this is the problem that we have, is that there are courses about Sikh history. This is the thing. The people who have made those courses on Sikh history, I do question if they've read pre-colonial history. What is pre-colonial history? You have Suraj Prakash, a gigantic text that takes, you know, basically longer than a PhD to get through. It would take longer than to get through Suraj Prakash, to get through it properly. Who has done that? Then on top of that, you have Bansabli Nama, 1769. You have Gurbalas Dasmi Pachai Chemi. So you have all these historical texts that come from the 1700s, 1800s. You know, who has read texts? And who has read those and then distilled them into historical books? If there are some, you know, I'd love to read them, but I feel like a lot of the historical texts, a lot of the courses that people are bringing to light nowadays are not based on anything historical. You know, they'll say something, and they won't reference where that information is coming from. And I feel like our generation, we're not having that. We're beyond that. You know, we've all been educated in the West. We want to see some referencing, right?
That's the generation we are. We are the generation that questions, you know, we don't just accept things at face value or you know, surface level anymore. And that's what Jawala's blog, mangalacharan.com, aims to do. You know, this unfiltered sort of resource to access these traditions of our gurus and ancestors without that colonial, you know, without sort of the colonial impact, you know, which obviously changed many things. It caused fractures in, you know, literature, musical traditions, and you know, you just name it, whatever. It really did have an impact and just changed the way we viewed things. So it is important that these texts, which were, you're saying they still read in some major takhts, but this was the norm. It's now not the norm, but it was once the norm, and we've just it's not really. It's just the way history has evolved, and such events have taken place and disconnected us. But you know, mangalacharan.com and the Suraj podcast, I mean, I love it, and I've seen on your Instagram the amount of people that share that they listen to it in their car going for a walk. It really is it's so addictive. And something that I really enjoyed was there's an episode on Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji's wedding. Where do you hear that? Where do you come across that? You know, we know the gurus were married, but this is quite a detailed account of how the maternal sort of figures around him dressed him, got him ready as you would, you know, for a Maya ceremony. And they partied and had food and had a good time, and I really liked that. It was so relatable. And often, I think modern sort of texts and stories, they don't make the gurus relatable in that way. And that's what I liked about this. You know, you see Guru Hargobind as one story. I don't want to give any spoilers for those that haven't listened to it. Suraj podcast on Spotify and SoundCloud, where he's it's quite graphic. Guru Hargobind is, he's gone into battle with someone. I won't name. And then he kind of annihilates this person, completely destroys them. But then he sits there and then contemplates and starts doing, is it Asadivar? He starts meditating. And that
Right.
sort of juxtaposition of he's just gone from completely destroying this man with his bare hands, breaking his head, his neck, everything. And then he's just sitting there trying to get respite. It's been a long, hard day. He finally gets to use Shastra Vidya, what he's been training for, he finally gets to use it. And then he just sits there and starts meditating. And I loved that insight that you've explored. And it's in English. It's in English. We can all understand it. There's music that, that aids the commentary as well. So there's some romantic music when it's talking about the guru and his wife. And then when it's the warm sort of, when they're in battle, then there's this, I don't know where you got that music from, but it's really cool. And when I'm listening to it and I'm cooking and walking, I just feel like, yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready for something. And it's so unique, and it kept me entertained during this lockdown period. And every time that little notification came up that there's a new episode, I used to get really excited. So good. So I would encourage everyone to check out Suraj podcast if you haven't. It's so important. It gives so much context to all the stories we've grown up with. Bidhi Chand, who stole the horses, it starts with that. But yeah, it's do check it out because the words don't do it justice. There's another question here, Jvala, and then I think after this question, we'll give another 10 minutes. If anyone has any more questions, oh yes, we have 2 questions here. Let's go to the top. Any information on Sarablo Granth Sahib that you can offer? That's the first question. And second one is, would you accept everything written in Suraj Prakash about our gurus? Or do you think Mahakavi adds taste to a lot of the text, as he's quite literally a storyteller? So Sandok Singh. Two questions there.
First question, just knock that out. Any information on Sarablo Granth, if you want, go to mangalacharn.com. And there's a whole section on it. I've been putting up posts about Sarablo for a very long time. There's translation, there's historical context, plenty of passages. So definitely check that out, mangalacharn.com. In regard to the second question, the question is, would you accept everything written in a historical granth, the Suraj Prakash that was completed in 1843? And this is a very interesting question because the question arises a lot of the time because when some people engage with its text, this text is 200 years ago. This text was written in a completely different context from what we are reading it now. And we have undergone quite a transformative process through the British colonial age in India. So when we're looking back at some of these texts, a lot of questions come to mind. Oh, could this have been done? Could, the gurus have said this? Is this a practice we used to do, right? So a lot of these questions come up. But what I would say is, if we are going to have an honest look at the history, we have to defer a lot more to the texts of old rather than, New Age texts. First of all, why do these questions rise, right? About, is this even possible? Would the gurus have done this? Is this something that, is this a practice that those questions arise because, these things are foreign to us. But really why is it foreign to us? And what do the other texts of the time say as well? When you start to collaborate and start to, cross-reference against texts of that time, you do see commonality. And this is why, if we go back to earlier when somebody was asking me about, what would you recommend for Sikh historical, texts in English? I find it very problematic to recommend texts in English because they don't reference the old, because they don't give deference to the old. A lot of the times because they haven't even read the old text. So from where they're gaining this information that they're writing upon, it's quite questionable. So what I would say to that is just give a lot more deference to the texts of old. These people, like Santokh Singh, have studied for more than a decade with the top teachers of that time, like Sant Singh. And the other writers of that time period as well had studied immensely. And when we consider how little we know about not only Sikh scripture, Gurbani, also about poetics, also about other historical writings that they were reading at that time, there's a mountain of difference between us and them. And for us to like spend a weekend, we may be an accountant, or we may be, I don't know, an HR person, or even like a doctor, lawyer, whatever. We spend 99% of the time doing other things. And then on that 1% of the time, we may read something on the weekend and say, oh, the Guru, this can't be true. It's like, on what basis are you forming your opinion is something that we should ask ourselves as well. So,
I mean, you said that Suraj Prakash Granth is a mammoth text. You my rapid fire round, you said that's the one book you would take because it would take you, you'd be stuck there for a long time. You still probably wouldn't finish it, right? And when you think about it in that regard, the amount of research, like you said, that got into it, such a mammoth text, it holds significance then, and therefore we do need to look at it.
It should be treated. In some of my research, as I'm digging into Suraj Prakash, I'm realizing that so those quotes from a lot of texts often, like this question was like, do you think he's just making stuff up? These stories are quite different from earlier texts. He's looking at Gurbalas Pachai Chemi, he's looking at Gurbalas Pachai Dasmi. This text from when he wrote it was received so well that it was read across all the different takhts in India, the 4 takhts at that time. This was institutionalized. Like this, everybody, approved of it. They gave their stamp at that time of it, right? So it deserves, quite a lot of deference, deserves a lot of respect in that regard. And it's something that I feel like people don't give a lot of respect to nowadays because they're ingrained in, whatever English texts that talk about Sikh history. And it also shows, like, when diving into this history through the podcast, if anybody listens on it, the amount of detail that we do have historically of the gurus, of their life, it does shock people that I can't believe that, we have texts that have written about, like you said, Guru Tegh Bahadur's wedding. What was the wedding like? What did they do? What were the practices that they partook in? So, for those who want to listen to the podcast, you'll get an insight into the text that way. I quite literally give synopsis, almost line by line, of what is in the chapter.
Yeah, I will speak on behalf of everyone that has listened to it, and do go check it out. You won't be able to stop. It's so good, and thank you, Jvala, for putting it together. I know I say thank you to you all the time every time there's a new episode. I really appreciate it. I really value it because, you're the one that's ultimately sitting there doing the research, which I'm going to put my hand up to admit I'm not going to do. I'm not a researcher, but in my spare time, I'm an avid reader and I love to read, especially, I like to call myself an Indophile, so I read anything on Indian history, but would I really take the time out to sit there and read that? I would like to say yes, but the truthful answer is no. So you're doing that. You're digging into this research and providing this English translation for us, and I feel like I'm indebted to you for that, and I really am grateful that you've put that out there. So do check it out, guys. We've got here. You should visit next year, UK. Maybe Jvala, you should visit next year. Oh, that was a major blip, isn't it? Great Insta Live. Thank you, Raju. I just wanted to, if there's any more questions, we'll do this for another 5 minutes, but something I just wanted to share, Jvala. I was researching this as well. Yeah, someone else. I always wait and look forward to a new episode. Yeah, we all do. And, Nevi, my husband, I called you Nevi by accident. When he'll say to me, oh, there's a new episode. And sometimes we'll sit there together in the garden, we'll listen to it. And we're responding to it physically, like, oh no, or we're excited, or we're sad, and it's your storytelling. I think it's very short. They're what, between 7 to 15 minutes, some of these, so there's no excuse. Someone else is doing the research, just listen to it. So much to gain from there. something I wanted to something I wanted to share. So you know the style of war ballads known as Wars that you are familiar with. I wanted to share something with you, and maybe you can just bounce some ideas back and forth. So you know, a var, like I said, is a heroic ballad. Chandi Divar, for example, right? So I was thinking about this. I was like, you know, Asa Divar. I thought, why is it called Asa Divar? Because, like I said, var is something to do with war poetry. And then I dug deep into it. Asa means it's a rag, and it means hope, hopefulness, upliftment. So this is the Ballad of Hope. Asa Divar is the Ballad of Hope. And again, everything comes back to the mind. Asa Divar explores the battle of the mind, but doesn't use war-like terminology or language or diction. So this var, Asa Divar, is laden with social concerns, just like how we mentioned Waris Shah's Heer gives us insight into Punjab in the 1700s. That's what Asa Divar does as well. So there's obviously glorification of the divine or glory of the divine, but also we get an insight into Punjab at the time that Guru Nanak was around through this Asa Divar. And it kind of has a worldly social perspective to it, and obviously a spiritual element as well. But just some notes that I made here, you know, through the spiritual experience of Asa Divar, the Ballad of Hope, you know, what you mentioned about the vices and how they battle one another. This is the battle with the worldly attachments of lust, anger, greed, attachment, and ego. So the var describes the internal conflict and confrontations of the individual. So essentially, you know, Asa Divar exposes the maladies of that society, and something which we are probably all familiar with, very, very famous verse from Asa Divar, is his verse on women, Pandajamya, Pandanimya, the verse which, the line from there, which is famous, So kyo manda akya jit jamme rajan. This is in Asa Divar. And this verse is referenced so much when it talks about how Guru Nanak elevated the status of women as early as the 15th century. You know, he's talking about that a woman is the center of life here on earth and in heaven. Man is born of woman. He's wedded to a woman. You know, only Guru Nanak, only the Lord or the Beloved is without woman. He also talks about how Hindus and Muslims have strayed from their sort of religious practices through greed, falsehood, tyranny. So he discusses all these things through Asa Divar, and I hear it in the morning, and I never connected the two. He just say Asa Divar, and then one day I thought, why is it called Var? And then when I looked at it properly, I thought, yes, he does discuss all these social ills and these maladies, again, bringing it back to the mind and the conflict of the mind, this battle between the vices, the same battle that is in the Gita, that's depicted through the Kauravas and the Pandavas. So just something I wanted to share with you. Maybe you can elaborate with Chandi Divar, and also if we could just finish, so we can elaborate on that with Dohiras. So I know last week you exploring the Dohiras, with the Dohas, this rhyming couplet, their technique, and then you even had a competition on your Instagram where you gave everybody a worksheet, a template to make their own. And I was reading some of them. I don't know how they were making these Dohiras. It was so good. But if we could just talk on those few points, and then we'll answer one more question, then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just mention the Dohra though. But yeah, so Dohra is a specific type of meter used in Raj poetry, Avadi poetry. So you see it in Guru Granth Sahib, in the later compositions. You start to see it used a lot in Dasam Granth Sahib by Guru Gobind Singh. Shastra is entirely out of Dohras, and a Dohra is basically a meter that has two bars, has two lines to it. There's each line, and this is the thing, it's like if you mention Dohra or Doha, it's also called in India, everybody would know what it is. Back in the day, it was kind of a very common meter. When we say haiku now, most people understand, a haiku has 3 lines with a certain type of syllable count. Doha is the same way. It has 2 lines though, and has a certain type of syllable count. So you have 13 syllables in the first portion, and then there's a visram, there's a, they call it in English, seshura, like a pause, and then there's 11 syllables afterwards, and it ends with a long, short combination at the end of each line. But, I put information up. There's a video about that on my page and on the Mangalacharn YouTube page. On Mangalacharn, the Patreon page, there's like a worksheet that people can kind of fill in, and people will kind of get an idea about how syllables are counted. So, that's out there, and people started writing their own dohras, and people then actually, some feedback about that was people started to realize how hard it was for them to even write one single dohra, right? One single verse in that type of meter style. And it really kind of shows how complicated poetics was, right? And kind of gives you appreciation to the work that Guru Gobind Singh and the other gurus they're writing like, vast amounts of poetry. And how were they doing that? In meters, like their understanding about poetic meters, poetics, how like emotions are evoked through different literary devices. It was so sophisticated.
Knowledge of loan words as well, Jvala, right? So Persian loan words, Sanskrit loan words, Raj, like, let's take Guru Gobind Singh, for example, and Guru Har Gobind, although he didn't write any verses or poetry or Gurbani, but they were fighting as well. They had families, and then they were writing all this poetry. And, not any old poetry, just exploring all these different literary poetic devices, incorporating so many different languages and loan words from other languages.
Yeah, what's really cool, I was looking at recently, this is on my Twitter, Job Sahib has like such beautiful, like Arabic and Sanskrit. There's Farsi as well, Persian in there as well, mixed with Braj and Farsi, like such a complicated and sophisticated mix that Guru Gobind Singh is using there. And it kind of shows us not only the audience, but also kind of like the context of that time. It was normal. And it's interesting when you think about even the names he gave for his sons, right? The first two, quite normal names in regards to Braj, Hindi, Punjabi, right? Jujhar Singh, Ajit Singh. But the last two, where those names come from? Zorawar Singh is an Arabic name. Like it's Zorawar is actually a word used in Quran and stuff as well, right? But it is also an Arabic term. So we can see there, like there's quite a type of language that people were using at that time, quite mixed, quite sophisticated in their ability to, mix in different languages into, their poetic style. And it shows how, like, they were appealing across language barriers, across religious barriers, across cultural barriers. When you think about even the majority of Guru Gobind Singh's works are written in Braj. Braj being, some people call it like an old Hindi, essentially. It is useful to think of it in that way, although it's not exactly 100% correct. But basically, it's like a Hindi, right? And it's not to say that Guru Gobind Singh did write in Punjabi. He has Chandi Diwars written in Punjabi. But that as well, a style at the time. So even the top Braj poets of that time, Nagari Das and the like, who wrote in like 1800s, they were primarily known for their Braj writings, but they also wrote in Punjabi as well. So like you had Braj poets who, to show their lyrical like dexterity, their ability to use different languages, they were writing in Punjabi as well. So it wasn't not outside the norm to write in multiple languages, but the way that Guru Gobind Singh did it was at the time just superb. But
just want to take this question, Jvala. My battery is dying, which hasn't happened before, so that just goes to show how exciting this conversation is. Let's take that question. When listening to the podcast, I wondered how such detail was known. For example, exact conversations that took place between people. So if we just keep that brief, and then we can end this session.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that 2 points to that. First being, you have a contemporary writing in that Sikh history by Persian sources, which even mentions like, wow, these people, they're talking about Guru Hargobind and his Sikhs. They're like, they remember the exact sword cuts that Guru Hargobind did in battle. Like, to them, that was important. They remembered it. They carried that forward. So this idea about how Sikh tradition has maintained traditions, conversation, text, even sword techniques in battle, it was important for them to know that. So that knowledge was passed down generation to generation, sina to sina, they call it. Also, these conversations, these points of reference were documented in earlier texts. Guru Pachai Chemi, Santokh Singh uses a lot from. When he's talking about conversations behind closed doors, we can kind of read the narrative style that Santokh Singh was doing. A narrative style.
Carry on while I get a charger, because I don't want this to cut off. It's just here, but carry on. Very unprofessional of me.
It's a good question. How do we know what was happening behind closed doors when they were having these type of conversations? A lot of the time, in that type of narrative style, to bring a point across, there will be some poetic license given to kind of get that point across. What were the major conversations happening at that time, and how to convey that? So I have an episode on the podcast that talks about mythology as well, and using that type of framework and these type of issues as well is important. So somebody had a question in regard to mythology, and I put out an episode. I think it's like episode 21. If you scroll through the podcast, you'll find it. Basically, there's in this type of narrative style of that time that Santokh Singh is writing, it was quite the norm to include mythology in storytelling. What does that mean? Does that mean the storytelling is not true? Or does that mean that they're using mythology as a narrative device to convey an idea, a principle, an underlying thought that is important for the story to hold place? Mythology is very complicated, and people should not think of it as just something that is false. A good way to think of it is that perhaps there's a meta truth that's trying to be expounded upon. So I would kind of use that type of framework to understand, perhaps at portions where maybe it's not believable that this actually happened. Perhaps this is a narrative style that the author is using to convey something deeper about not only maybe the relationship between two people in conversation, but kind of a meta truth about the situation of that time. And a question regarding, I don't want to ruin, I don't think this is a spoiler, but at some point, Heer, one of the grandsons of Guru Hargobind, is basically writing letters to Emperor Shah Jahan, siding with him, saying that, I'll remain in your, I'll be obedient to you and all that type of stuff. And Heer at that time was quite small. He was quite young at that time. So I got a question in regard to, if he was so young, how was he writing these letters? How was he integrating, these type of sophisticated politics? Taking care of the city of Prakash when, Guru Hargobind leaves for Heer. It's a good question. But a lot of the times in that narrative style, one person can also represent a faction or a group of people. So when they're talking, in that narrative style, it may be difficult to go into the complexities about, a group, formations and like who is involved exactly in regard to a certain division, but they'll just associate it with a person, right? And, that person will then encompass the entire group. Again, this is a narrative style of that time that people use, right? To kind of...
Is it, sorry, Jvala, the question expands here. Is this the same for when he says what people were thinking?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps narrative style, that framework to understand it from that lens as well. Oftentimes, we do have contemporary sources that talk about what the Guru was thinking, as in he would tell people, right? So then when people are writing this, they would go back and insert that, the Guru thought this, so then he did that, right? So storytelling and narrative formation, just like how poetics is complicated, in the same way, different, storytelling and narration becomes very complicated. And we have to understand how the audience is hearing this. And maybe because of that narrative style, that lands easier on the audience. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there's one thing, and this is a point that I did want to mention, and it ties into poetics, it ties into Proverbs, is that how do you tell a story, right? Tell a story just by saying, okay, on this day, this guy was born, he went over here, he created a house here, and he had a family, and he died at this age in whatever year. Is that a story? Are you moved by that story? So what is Santokh Singh trying to do, right? He's trying to move people with this story to evoke emotion. He's a poet, he's a writer.
He's a storyteller as well, right? And that's the storyteller's job, to make you imagine and feel things, right? So yeah, he's using. I'll let you explain it, but yeah, it's essentially what a storyteller's job is, isn't it? Like a musician, to evoke emotions, tap into feelings and moods and things.
Exactly, and that does not mean that what he's saying is incorrect. You know what I mean? He's using a different mechanism to evoke a certain emotion, tell you a truth about a situation, right? That's very, very important. And it's like, and then you start to look at what's the effect of the text. People are still reading this text today. It's 200 years later, and people are still reading it. People are still, like you said, you're walking around, you're listening to it. People are still affected by the text. It's not that somebody reads it and somebody draws a point from that text to say, oh, in this text, it says the Guru went to this place at this year, and that's important. Is that important? What's more important, like, I get feedback, people mention, even when they read Nanak Prakash, written in English by Jeevanpal Singh, Resham Singh, people cry when they read these stories. You know, people are inspired by it. People are pumped up.
I'm great. Yeah.
Right?
I mean, with the Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji story, I said to Nabi, I wish I was. This is going to sound a bit odd, but the way that story was described and the way that the two families met, I was like, I wish I married him. That it made me feel like that, you know. I wish that I was a daughter-in-law in that home, of the home of the Guru. The way that story was told, and that's something I've never thought about before. I've never thought about that. Of course, it would be wonderful to be. I'm assuming it would be wonderful to be married into the home of a Guru, right? But you didn't think about it. But the way that story was narrated made me think about that, made me just pause and contemplate that feeling. Essentially, that's what a storyteller does. But we're going to have to end it here, Jvala, because it's going to be nearly another hour now, and I don't want to interrupt you mid-conversation, but it's been 2 hours, which I did not anticipate for. I actually had a yoga class now that I had paid for, but I was like, you know what, I'm going to continue this because this is such a good conversation. And before, I rang Jvala and I said, look, we have to cap this at 1 hour. But this has gone on, and it just goes to show how, you know, engaging this conversation is and how many people enjoy your podcast, right? Kunal, you had a comment here. People would have walked and traveled miles to learn such knowledge. What you were saying about the depth of these texts and what the themes and topics they explore. You know, they would have invested their whole lives into these. This is not just like a weekend venture. You know, I have an idea that's popped into my head. This takes years of work, which we don't have the ability or the patience or time to do these days. So, you know, with that in mind, it is something worth investigating and looking at for that reason. Like you said, it sheds light on so many. You know, if you want, books are time machines. If you want to go back to that time period, that's the best way to do it. And that's what your podcast allowed me to do. And I know it allowed thousands of listeners to do. I just felt like I could be doing something, like I said, cooking, walking, whatever. And I'm in that moment, I'm visualizing that battle. I'm visualizing the Guru getting married. I'm visualizing, you know, Guru Har Gobind feeling a bit sad, melancholy, lonely, whatever. I really would, I've said it so many times, I just urge everybody to listen to that podcast if you haven't already. It is mind-blowing, and one of the best podcasts I've heard in a long time. So thank you so much, Jvala, for your time. Your research, and you give me 2 hours of your time. I really appreciate that. And thank you to everyone that was part of the first conversation you participated, and then rejoined this one. It really means so much to me. This is, this was the topic of language that we're exploring today as part of South Asian Heritage Month in the UK. First time it's being celebrated, and I really wanted to talk about the literary traditions of Gurbani because it's so vast. Like you said, this 2 hours isn't enough to explore this, these kind of topics. And there's a lot of young, prominent poets coming out in the diaspora now, and some of them, they make that sort of reference or that nod to Gurbani as being the inspiration for wanting to be a poet. Just as music, right? This is another topic that I'm going to explore with a researcher who's going to be exploring the impact of music, partition on music, specifically for women, and that will be just leading up to in partition or independence. And next week, this will be commemorating partition. And if we think about Guru Granth Sahib, is poetry written to specific musical modes. So what does that say? It says how important music is and how important language and poetry is in our culture, in our faith specifically. So I wanted you to shed light on that. You're doing your research, and your book is, as we mentioned, we discussed earlier, 54 Punjabi Proverbs, is available this week on Amazon UK because it sold out because it was that good.
Yeah, I'll be putting up announcements and about when it's fully available in UK on Amazon. It should be in the next 2 weeks. It's available in Canada on Amazon, and anywhere else. Just send me a message if you want a copy. We can arrange it. But yeah,
Jvala is your Instagram handle, where you share stuff on Proverbs, and also manglacharan.com and Suraj podcast. These are the three resources that, if you want to find out more about Sikh historical texts and traditions, everything we've discussed today, you'll get a detailed sort of insight into that on these accounts. And I will share it on my Insta story as well. So if you're not following Jvala already, then, do check him out and support Manglacharan and the work that he's doing. This is tiring work to translate these into English for the benefit of us all to have access to this information. So you can support his project, www.patreon.com/Manglacharan. So check out other works on that website as well. But thank you for your time. Bahut shukriya. I'm going to let you go, and we'll save this to IGTV. So if anyone wants to catch up, you have 2 hours worth of catching up with this conversation. Thank you and good night.
Bye.